Good afternoon, distinguished speakers and distinguished participants, and welcome to this lab on low carbon markets, green and also free. For many years we have been discussing mainly in the political discourse targets, long-term targets, what obligations should we have now that the world is converging on the net zero by 2050, possibly actually earlier, if we want to meet the climate change objectives. The debate has now very much shifted to policy tools. How can we get there? What should be done? Which tools should be applied to what? How much market do we want nationally, European-wide, international? But also what market-based policies could be used or should be used. And I'm just looking here at Michael Bloss and also Veronika Grimm, who are Germans, and we are right in the middle of a German election campaign where this is discussed every day. And I suspect it will be one of the hottest issues as we continue with these elections. Now, these are the topics we would like to discuss today with Dragán, who is a state secretary in the Ministry for Energy in Romania, with Michael Bloss, who is a member of the European Parliament for the Greens and the European Free Alliance, Charlotta Groth, a managing director of global macroeconomics of the group investment management of Zurich insurance company, and then Veronika Grimm, member of the Council of the 5 economic experts, known in Germany as the Wirtschaftsweise. Now, before we kick off the discussion, let me just give you a number of ground rules. First of all, important, the session is live streamed, so we are fully public. Then I also would mention that the labs have always been, and also this one online, are fully interactive. We want to focus on the debate rather than on presentations, and that's true for both the speakers and the participants. So speakers have about 5 minutes for their introduction, and I will check on them that they stick to this. And the participants, they will have around 2 minutes to comment or to ask questions. I should also mention that our invisible hand will be Xavier Hadidi, who will run the platform, give you access or doesn't give you access, etc., etc. And my name is Christian Egenhofer. I'm an associate senior research fellow here at CEPS at the Energy, Climate and Resource team, and a senior research associate at the School of Transnational Governance at the European University Institute in Florence. Now, there are some tools available for you, for all the participants. The most important is the question and answer. You see it on the left. This is the icon where you have this question mark. Please use this as a chat and not on the right-hand one. So we will look at these questions as they come in. And I would like to ask all participants to put a like or not to those. So we want to ask the questions which have the most interest. We want to pick them. So just put a dot, click on them, and then we know whether this is a question you like. If you don't click on them, that's a question you like less. The second most important, or maybe equally important icon is the one on the second one where you see they can ask the request for broadcasting. Just click to it and you see if you want to speak up, put this request for broadcasting, and then we put you on screen and you can speak with us as the speakers do. There is one on the top which is leave the meeting, but you don't really need that one. No need to use that one. So now let's start. I hope this is all for as introduction, and let's start now with the discussion. I hope it's all clear how much market is possible, how much market is needed, what extent do we need bans and phase out plans, hard regulation, And also, of course, how can EU policy strengthen the competitiveness of the European and the resilience of the European economy, while, of course, ensuring social acceptability? Climate policy without social acceptability will not go very fast. This is why we start with the Romanian State Secretary, Drăgan. You are faced with a dying or maybe already dead coal industry due to EU policy, due to domestic climate policy, due to the European emissions trading system. So how do you deal with this situation? But more important, of course, is, what do you see? What kind of climate policy can you develop for your country? What can the EU do? How can it help? And what would you expect in terms of assistance? Finally, there is, of course, there's assets in Romania. You have a very strong IT sector in Bucharest, in Cluj, Napoca. So there is huge assets. On the one hand, you have traditional industries. On the others, you have challenges. So please, we would like to hear your views for 5 minutes. Over to you. Thank you. You're muted.
Okay, now I'm in. Good afternoon, distinguished guests. Christian, thank you for organizing this event and giving the opportunity to debate one of the most important subjects in the energy field, the impact of European Green Deal and the cost-efficient way to low-carbon technologies. As you know, Romania is fully engaged in the collective endeavor for climate neutrality and the deep transformation of our societies and economies. These transformations are expected to position EU at the forefront of the global efforts to curb climate change and to make European economies stronger and more resilient. Green growth is an ambition and a challenge for many local areas and regions. The ambition comes from the desire to act on a climate change and to take advantage of the positive environment for economic factors that can flow from these activities. Romania has a clear objective to increase the share of renewable energy sources, including hydrogen, correlated with the decommissioning of coal capacities. The creation of a regulatory framework is favorable for renewables and low carbon gases will give us solid premises for an increase of share of renewables by taking the excess of this electricity from the grid. At the same time, natural gas plant we foreseen in order to replace transitionally the coal capacities and most importantly to act a reserve power for the period when wind and solar energy will not be available. A more ambitious climate target in this economic context by the pandemic is more difficult to be achieved by member states, and here I'm referring also to Romania, and regions with a higher share of fossil fuels in their energy mix, with higher greenhouse gas emissions and energy intensity and lower GDP per capita. Some of high CO2 emission sectors and regions whose economies are dependent on them will undergo substantial challenges. In this situation, distribution issues will have to be addressed to ensure that no one is left behind. With regards to the rate of job losses associated with the energy and climate policy, it is obvious that in regions where high carbon industries are now very important, specific policies and investment will be needed in order to benefit from the support of just transition mechanisms. The social aspect must complement the decarbonization of this region so that human resources will be correctly distributed in the economic sector and areas where is needed. This purpose will be achieved by developing territorial just transition plans in a correct and efficient manner and by addressing precisely the opportunities and challenges for economic recovery of these areas. In this context, the priorities and measures included in the territorial just transition plans will be linked to the decarbonization measures set out in the national energy and climate plans in order to ensure policy cohesion and the integration of new investment in economy and infrastructure in the future energy model. We consider that this is the biggest challenge for us, namely how we manage to decouple in these areas the energy issues from the social one. Both are equally important and require rigorous and simultaneous planning. The decarbonization of the energy production sector through the transition from coal through natural gas and renewable is urgent action needed to achieve our energy objective targets that was set up for 2030, which are highlighted in all national programmatic documents. Renewable gases and hydrogen, green and blue, are needed for decarbonizing of the energy, industrial and transport sector. However, we foreseen as a transitory blue hydrogen to be a suitable solution. In time, green hydrogen will enter the energy mix as the ideal solution. When it does, we'll have the benefit from hydrogen value chain already in place, thanks to a committed to blue hydrogen today. At the same time, we plan to develop several projects integrating gas to power, renewables and green hydrogen, included under the important project of common interest. We are taking consideration to participate in a pan-European supply chain in the Danube region for producing hydrogen in the Southeast Europe at a large scale by using renewable sources. Therefore, the development of this project will be able to contribute to achieve our climate goals, reduce dependence of energy imports, increase security and energy supply, strengthen industrial sectors and create jobs. EU ETS should remain the main driver of the EU policy in terms of delivering emissions reduction and addressing the risk of carbon leakage. In this respect, Romanians appreciate the intention to develop effective and complementary instruments, such as carbon border adjustment mechanisms, to further address the risk of carbon leakage. The new instrument will have to be complementary to the free allocation under EU ETS. So these are the first thoughts that I want to express, and I am very happy to be together today with you and to be able to have also interactive action and to respond to the questions and to share ideas.
Thank you very much for this. You set out the challenges you have. I read you have a lot of plans. Well, not all of them will be easy. And I'm sure we're coming back to the question of hydrogen, whether blue and green. But I know Veronika has been working on this as well recently. But let's go to Michael Bloss. Michael, there has been recently a bit of skepticism about within the Greens on carbon pricing. And just very recently, your former colleague, Groth, I don't know whether you still know what he's saying all the time, has been very negative about, he's now environment minister in Luxembourg, for those who don't know him. He has been very, very critical about enlarging the scope of the ETS, which was a bit of an interesting logic of him, because he said, that will not be socially acceptable. Now, we all assume that ETS is an efficient policy. Yes, it's very transparent. And therefore maybe not socially acceptable easily. But nevertheless, now, what is your take on this? Should we instead move to regulation, which is less visible and has maybe possibly higher costs? Should we move on bans for internal combustion engine, on gas, a favorite topic of the Romanians, or of oil? So, Michael, what are you taking out of this? I mean, you're speaking personal capacity, yeah.
Right. Thank you very much also for inviting me to this interesting conversation. I didn't know that Groth said this recently, but I tend to agree with him. So that's good, because that we are coming from the same direction of thought. So basically, I mean, when we're thinking about markets and instruments, the first thought I have is that altogether we have a market failure. We have external costs of CO2 emissions that are not inside the price right now. So we have to fix that somehow. That's the overall problem. And how to fix it, I think we need a clear mixture of instruments and what instrument to choose should guide us the question, what is really fit for purpose and what helps us to achieve our objective. And the objective is to reduce as much as CO2 emissions or greenhouse gas emissions as soon as possible, and it should be socially acceptable and just. And then I think that kind of gives this different views on the different instruments. So looking at what we currently have, we have the ETS for the energy sector and for the industry sector, and we see that it's working rather well after some time where it didn't work at all, and we have now high prices of even above 50 euros on the ETS side. However, the prices are not necessarily the produce of demand and supply. We actually have an oversupply of emission certificates, but they are also the result of speculation and of course assuming an overall ETS reform. So we see, however, that in the industry sector, it did not really work that well. The biggest CO2 emission reduction comes from the energy sector. In the industry sector, we have from 2005 to 2018 only around 1% of emission reduction. And this is a big, apparently we need to do something more here. So, but we are, for instance, seeing that there is this free allocation that should be for carbon leakage protection, but on the other hand, they take away the incentive for industry to change. And what we need is incentives to change. So we have to find a better solution here. The carbon border adjustment is one of it. When we look onto the transport sector, we currently see that regulation, CO2 standards for cars actually work quite well. We see that even though there was a huge resistance against these regulation, especially from the car industry, the investment of the car industry has changed, and they invest a lot into the production and to the development of e-cars. We have a leap of 400, I think, and 15% more e-cars from 2020 April to 2021. So there's a lot of things happening, and the costs for this change is actually the investment costs of industry. Now, if we would, I'm against also an ETS in the system. If we would put an ETS on transport, first of all, we have kind of bargaining costs. So an ETS would also mean that the CO2 standards for cars would be not as ambitious. And I would like to have CO2 standards for cars, that meaning phasing out combustion engines by 2030. So second is the social question. Currently, the costs of the transformation are the investment costs of the industry. Having a second ETS would mean that consumers would have to pay the higher costs. And there is the idea that higher costs would mean changing the means of transport. But that's in reality not always true. If you have only, 2 buses a day to your home, it does not change your mode of transport. It just increases the costs. Second, for us, for as Greens, it is clear that we can only have a successful green transformation if it is socially just and acceptable. So in Germany, we have a kind of mini ETS, but we Greens demand to have direct payments to citizens that actually results into a progressive policy, giving poorer households more than it is actually taken away from them. On the European level, this is not possible. We cannot give these direct payments. So it's really difficult to solve the social question on the European level because there's just no competency for it. And thirdly, such an ETS would be very ineffective in the beginning. I guess we do not have the data for setting up the ETS. It will be like a huge technical thing to set it actually up. then possibly it would start with really little amounts of money, of prices like 30 euros or so in 2026, 2027. And we know that we need around 200 euros per ton of CO2 in order for it to be effective. But we will not see that. So it will be a system that is very ineffective. It takes a long time. It basically gives us a lot of opportunities to say why we cannot act right now. Whereas with CO2 standards for cars, giving also investors, giving companies a clear phase-out date that is plannable, and also the Commission should be asking member states to put up charging station, because currently they are not daring to ask actually the Commission the member states to have compulsory numbers on charging stations. So with these regulatory policies, I think we are much faster and more cost efficient than having an inefficient ETS that actually will not change a lot.
Okay, thank you, Michael. Can I interrupt you here for
Please.
2 reasons? Your 5 minutes are over, but the other one is even more interesting. I think you put up quite a few provocative points, and I'm sure the other 2 speakers, or the other 3 actually, will have some issues with those, and people in the audience as well. Thank you. Maybe we go to Charlotta. You have heard the previous speakers, and also Michael, who said, among many other things, he said, the regulation gives more security to the investors. Now, you are an investor, so maybe, Charlotta, I would like to hear what you're saying. I mean, what you want to say, but maybe also on these points, and then we also go later on to the other speakers again. But of course, still waiting for Veronika. Charlotta.
Thank you, Christian. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, very well.
First of all, thank you so much for inviting me to this session. It's very interesting, and I'm privileged to be here and speaking to this panel, really. So I'm going to put on my business hat here and really take that perspective, because I think that's really the role here. And I'm a part of a global insurance company, Zurich Insurance. As an insurer, we are very exposed to climate change related risk, both on the kind of liability side of selling insurances. They will be affected by future changes to extreme weathers, flooding, windstorms, even health effects, you name it. But also on the other side, on our balance sheet, which is our assets that we hold to be able to pay out insurance claims in the future. Those assets, the prices of those assets are also hugely affected by climate change related risk. And the reason for starting out by saying this is I don't think Zurich Insurance is so different from other industries. I think all businesses are affected by climate change. I think this will be, I would say, it will be the biggest driver of transformation, not only of the energy system or the transportation system, but also the global economy for the coming decades. So I think for businesses to be relevant going forward, they need to take these climate change risks and opportunities very, very seriously, and think about them, what it means from a strategic point of view. So that's kind of my starting point around this topic. I think it should be at the core of everyone's business strategy from now on. And I think recent events which have come out around challenging the way some businesses operate, that shows that risk. Now, Zurich, we have argued for quite a long time now that a price of carbon would be very useful, both as an insurer, but also as an investor, to be able to price the carbon, to get a better feeling for the footprint, the carbon footprint that different businesses have. And also, maybe more importantly, to drive the global economy towards a position where you're actually dealing with climate change. Because if you do that, it's easier to try to tackle climate change as an individual business. You don't have to swim against the stream. You can kind of follow the stream. So I think that's kind of a starting point. But carbon prices, that's ultimately a political decision. we as a business can have views and opinions, but we don't set the carbon price. And I think we can communicate that very clearly. But for us, we just have to start acting and not waiting for a carbon price to be there. I think that's a bad excuse for not doing things around climate change. So I wanted to highlight two things, and it touches a little bit on Michael's points in the prior session. The first one is, what can businesses do, and can you benefit from market forces without having actually a price of carbon, without pricing that externality? And I think you can. And I think what we're seeing right now is we're seeing this happening. And I call it a network effect. You have different networks. We talked about the auto industry already. I work in the financial services industry, where different types of alliances are forming between different, in our case, insurance companies and pension funds that, first of all, have a target. We want to go net zero by 2050, say. That's a nice target to have, but actually it doesn't do that much. I think more recently what's really important is that these actors who have this target, they're actually starting to break them down. What does it mean for our strategy over the next 2 years, over the next 5 years, over the next 10 years? What are we going to do to get to that 2050 target? And once you do that as a business operating within a network of other businesses, is you start creating demand for new solutions. In our case, it's, for example, is demand for data. We don't know which companies have the biggest carbon footprint. We don't know what their strategies are going to look like going forward. And looking at nation states, we don't know what sovereigns are doing a lot to tackle climate change and which aren't. And all of a sudden, you're seeing a creation of an industry which provides that data, a solution, and also other things like green investment opportunities. And I think you're seeing this in the financial sector, you're seeing it in the auto industry, you're seeing it in the shipping industry. That's another example we have, where you have big actors saying, well, we actually want to have a carbon neutral shipping by 2023. Can you give it to us? And you create a market opportunity. And then the same forces come into play as if you had put a price on that carbon. So I think a lot of very positive things can happen without the carbon price, without having the perfect carbon price. And I think what we're seeing right now is that happening. The other key point I wanted to make, so I'll move over to that so I have time to say it, is, well, if we don't have a global carbon price, and I think the likelihood that we will have it over the next decade is quite low, actually, what do businesses really want? And here I'm speaking from myself as an investor, and I think what businesses would really want is certainty. It's a removal of uncertainty about the trajectory going forward. Of course, this is a hugely complex and uncertain field, so we shouldn't oversimplify it. But as much as possible, lay out clarity around what policies are we trying to put in place over the coming decade. And the reason why it's so important is, over the coming decade, you just need to scale up investment and funding going into climate change by huge amounts. Comparing to the COVID crisis, this is basically COVID crisis every year. This is huge. And you need clarity around that, because if you have clarity, risk premia are going to come down, and it's going to make it easier to move into that. So maybe to end on a provocative note, I think for businesses, I think it could be better to have a lot of clarity, but no carbon price, than to have a carbon price, but a lot of uncertainty. So I leave it on that one. And
okay, Charlotta, thank you. I was quickly disconnected, so this gave you some extra minutes. But I also saw that Michael was nodding. So Veronika, I hope that you are not also agreeing with all this. So please, Veronika, what is your take on this, on the carbon price and all the other questions we have raised?
Yeah, thank you very much. So I'm actually very much in favor of carbon pricing, and I want to a little bit draw the picture why this is the case. it need not. I agree that it's not the only tool in order to get to carbon neutrality, but it's a very important tool to coordinate. So the EU and many other countries, regions around the world have committed to climate neutrality by 2050 or around 2050. And this is a big chance, but carbon neutrality also means a very profound transformation of our economy and also of the way we live together, the way we are mobile, the way we meet, real or virtual, and how we consume, how we pay. Everything will change very fundamentally, and we have to coordinate this process. And pricing is a very powerful tool to coordinate people doing the thing in an efficient or cost efficient way. We will need innovations in all areas of the economy, and especially in digitization and technologies that promote climate neutrality. And they will play a very decisive role in this, because we want to enable us to do things and not to undo things on the way to carbon neutrality, also because of acceptance. The people will not follow that way if they have to go into a degrowth path. This will be very unlikely that we manage to follow that such a way. So we will need to use increasingly renewable electricity to decarbonize or defossilize all sectors of the economy via direct electrification, use of heat pumps, battery electric vehicles, but also via hydrogen and synthetic energy carriers based on it in heavy mobility in industry, and also as a feedstock for the industry. And in this process, we will build completely new value change. We'll have to build on the expertise of the European industry to produce key components for this new energy world: electrolyzers, fuel cells, vehicles, logistics solutions, networks, all that stuff, which will also create value and employment for people in Europe. And we must not only look at the change at home, but also what is happening worldwide. There are quite different strategies. For example, in Asia, technology development is very fast, but they don't decarbonize at the same path, but they do it with fossil energy carriers in order to get the technology expertise, but then are able to switch faster as soon as renewable energy carriers are there. So there are different strategies, and they will also decide on our competitiveness in the European Union as compared to Asia, for example, or similar things are happening in the US. All over the world, business will no longer have much to do with the old ones. One impressive example is in agriculture. Today we use pesticides, but they will have to be replaced. And in all likelihood, they will be replaced by technologies that have nothing whatsoever to do with the original business field. So first we will, the use of pesticides will be optimized with the help of artificial intelligence, using big data, weather data, and so on, to reduce the use of pesticides. And the second technology will be genetic engineering that will change plants. And it is not yet clear which of these future business areas will be established in Europe or elsewhere, depending on the conditions those industries find in Europe versus elsewhere. That happens to many industries, and I think the governments cannot plan this. They must create framework conditions for sustainable business development that provides good conditions in Europe for all these new future business fields that have to be developed. And that means that we need real economic conditions that have to change. The CO2 price must rise, I think. But on the other hand, we can lower taxes and levies, and this will lead to a fair transition. Actually, I strongly believe that CO2 pricing is one of the fairest ways to do climate change, because it's transparent and it does not come with processes that people cannot follow and that redistribute in many, many ways towards the rich. That's what happens if there is a negotiation going on, lobbying going on, and so on. There are many mechanisms that lead to redistribution towards the rich, which is also a problem of, in Germany, for example, the EEG levy, which is more paid by poor people than by rich who probably have a solar panel on their roof and do not pay it to the extent that the poor people have to pay it. Then we need a financing ecosystem that has been mentioned just by Charlotta. And financing ecosystem has to be strengthened. We have much less venture capital in Europe than we have in the US or in East Asia. And I think in order to make it interesting to invest, and in order to also reduce the regulatory uncertainty that investors face, it is crucial to have something transparent, like, for example, CO2 pricing, low electricity prices that make all these business models that involve sector coupling profitable and interesting to investors. And I think that's a very important issue. Of course, we need to give investors reliable timelines for the transformation and the expansion of infrastructure. I think that's crucial. We need reliable timelines for the expansion of infrastructure, because I will not sell any cars if the customers don't believe they can charge it. So this has to be clear. At what timelines can I scale up the production of cars? I need investment in research and development. And of course, also in subsidies for certain industries that have to switch quickly. In Germany, there's a big debate on the steel industry, but there are also ways to do it more or less efficiently. And I think the main goal must be to reduce regulatory uncertainty and reduce the overlap of regulation in order to prepare the ground for competition for innovations. Politics must not take over market risks and must not create investment security. That's what markets do. Market actors are used to take market risks. That's their business. And so I think that's very important, not to take over the risks, because that's too expensive for the state. We will not be able to do this, but because this transformation is so huge. Today, maybe one last issue today, private investment is 8 times what the state is investing in Germany. That's the relation is 8 to 1. And we will not be able to take over the investment risk of the private industry, but have to give them, I think, reliable investment conditions. Maybe so far.
Thank you. Thank you. Lots of new points to mention. Maybe on this last one, at some stage also Charlotta could come in. There is a recent study in the surroundings of the Gates family, the breakthrough energy, which shows that Europe is doing very well in R&D, early deployment, but we are very, very badly doing on growth money. You know, the US attracts about 54% of the growth money. The EU 7, that's as much as the UK does. So somehow our policy prescriptions seem not to be attractive for the investors. Maybe Charlotta, you could just very briefly, come on this, and then we become a little bit more concrete on the industry side.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. Because this transformation is very much about technology, and we can look at the technology sectors and we know who the global leaders are. They are not Europeans, they are predominantly from the United States. So I think there is a question to be asked, why is this? Clearly, I think Europe has all the capabilities that are required. And they also have a history now, because they've been in the game longer than in the US. I think Veronika touched on very important issues. One is, how do we get investment flowing into those risk venture capital opportunities? One has to do with regulation. Europe is still a fractured market. There are different regulations in different countries. it makes it more difficult to be a player that try to kind of do this on a European scale. The other one is around certainty for the market solution to function. You really need to have certainty around regulation, carbon pricing, everything. This is what I touched on before.
Charlotta,
Yeah.
could I interrupt for fraction of the fragmentation of the market? Yes, but certainty, I mean, in the US on climate policy, no, you cannot tell me this.
Yeah.
So it must be the fragmentation. It cannot be that in the US there's certainty what they do in the next 50 years on climate change.
I think what I touched on so far is really around the tech sector, because we don't really know what the climate kind of sector looks like yet, because it's starting to grow now. So what I'm trying to say is let's not repeat any of those mistakes. As an investor, I think there are also some kind of technical reasons. There are balance sheet constraints. There is risk regulation that can make it very, very difficult to invest in more riskier assets, because the cost of that, the capital cost of that, is high for an investor. There is a size, which I think is really critical. As a large institutional investors, and you want those players to move into this market, because that's bigger money, they're bigger flows. It's difficult for them to invest in a number of small projects. They want in some way to pool their assets that they can invest, get maybe not scale advantages, but not to have to deal with identifying each individual project. So I think there is something around how do you do that in the European level. As an investor, we are very keen, for example, to buy green bonds at the EU level or from the European Investment Bank. But we're not seeing that. We're actually not seeing the scale of issuance at those levels yet. So I think there's a lot of things that we can do to better match the demand from institutional investors with the supply of green investment opportunities, because at the moment there's a lack of those opportunities, at least from our point of view, which means that actually when there is a green bond issued, there's a huge oversubscription. Too many people want to invest in that.
Okay, thank you. Let's be a little bit getting more concrete. I think we've been discussing the fragmentation, the absence of integrated capital markets, and many other points. We have been discussing them probably for too long already. So Michael, leaving the genetic engineering, which Veronika has mentioned aside, let's stick to the industrial decarbonization. It's a question to Michael and also the State Secretary. On industry, and Veronika has mentioned this, we have now a lot of forthcoming green steel projects. There are projects on cement, on green cement. There is projects on carbon capture and storage. There is at least one storage thing which is now happening. Now on the technology side, we are quite good. So how would you want to take the industry decarbonization further? I was struck by one point you made, the 1%. The industry hasn't done a lot, true. Then you also mentioned we do need to move to do as fast as possible, but industry will not be very fast. First, we need to develop the technology that by 2030 and a bit later, they can really at scale develop it. So what is your prescription? And then also, State Secretary, do you see how you want to take this further? Your industrialized countries, you have a lot of natural resources which you want to use. Michael, now, please.
Thank you. Very interesting points. Also, I could comment a lot, but I try to focus on this one. First of all, I think it's very sad to see that the European Commission does not really take this on. We have now the second industrial strategy, and it all sticks on the strategy level, but we really would need to see more substantive legislative proposals. So when I understand that, for instance, Thyssen wants to have its first change of steel planned in 2025, we need the legislation now and soon, and not kind of only debating it on the European level in this old strategy and let's have like a pilot project on carbon contracts for difference. No, we would actually need to see a rollout of carbon contracts for difference now happening.
How do you want to do this? What would be your suggestion, your legislative proposal or whatever?
Yeah, so for instance, this is also the question how we do it in the ETS. If we change the free allocation system with higher prices, there is more revenues. We can use, for instance, these revenues to pay for such carbon contracts for difference and to give some certainties for investors that there will be, well, a guaranteed price. And in this regard, it's a little bit the society that actually takes on the risk. But as we saw in the energy transition in Germany, it was also first, we as a society decided we want to have renewable energies and we will guarantee a price for it. And that actually sparked the transition. And I think in the same way, now we have to do it with industry and put up a regulatory environment that is then enabling this transformation. So that's carrot and stick. Yeah, the carrot is, for instance, this contracts for difference. More importantly, because more certainty, quotas. Because if I understand, like if there is, for instance, a 10% quota of renewable steel for cars, Charlotta can. Oh no, Charlotta can invest into ThyssenKrupp, and because she knows that there will be a market take up for sure, yeah, well that's it. some proposals, but the point is that we have the debate, unfortunately, on a very like abstract level, and we do not really see now concrete policy proposals that come up. Maybe now Christian is back.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I just said it's okay. It's changing the free allocation because it doesn't really provide incentives. It is quotas because that's real certainty for investors. There will be a market uptake of decarbonized products. It is this carbon contracts for difference, and of course, it is a lot of more investment into renewables because if you change a steel plant and you do not have green hydrogen, then you do not have CO2-free steel.
Okay, thank you. Maybe Dan, if you allow me a second, would like to have first Veronika, and then we give the word to you, and then there is a request for someone else to speak up. So Veronika, change free allocation, quotas, and CCFDs, carbon contract for differences. Are you convinced?
No, I would like to challenge this a little bit for several reasons. I mean, the proposal to take the revenues from the CO2 pricing and to give it to steel companies somehow is not a very just transition, because you could take the revenues and give it back to the people and increase their incentives to engage in sector coupling in many ways which would enable or which would speed up emission reductions, because people take the right decisions. People switch to battery electric cars if they foresee that there will be a huge advantage of applications, installations, goods that allow them to continue in a carbon neutral way. The second issue why I would be a little bit critical to give a lot of money to existing industries that run into huge problems is that we have a huge bias already today to decarbonize industries that are there. And there's a lot of demand for money, for subsidies. But you overlook those future industries which will possibly scale up hugely and bring revenue and jobs. So by decarbonizing those old industries, we will not create new jobs. we will maybe keep old ones and maybe hinder the reallocation of value chains that would happen anyway if we go into a carbon neutral future and in future trade renewable energy carriers. So the comparative advantage of different regions to produce hydrogen and to produce ammoniac from it, and possibly also to produce green steel, the comparative advantages are different. And so I would think it is not, we have to be very careful. I think also that we have to keep steel production in Europe to a certain extent, but we have to be very careful that it does not become too expensive. We would have to think about transition paths that are not going via green hydrogen immediately, but for example, we could install the direct reduction steel plants and run them on the basis of gas, and then switch as soon as enough green hydrogen is available and it's cheap enough to green hydrogen. So they are hydrogen ready, but it's much less expensive in terms of subsidies to bring them forward and then switch as soon as they're hydrogen ready, and it would not, and the decrease of emissions would not be hindered because the green hydrogen that is available could be used otherwise in other industries, in other sectors where also future value can be created and innovations can be promoted. So I think that's, I think the focus on existing industries, we have to be very careful that we don't over-focus on existing industries and overlook future value creation in the same, at the same moment.
Now, thank you, Veronika. I mean, Michael, that's quite an interesting twist. The Greens are accused of defending the old structures, but let's go to Dragoș, Drăgan. You know, how do you see this transformation? How could you push that? You have seen a couple of proposals, carbon contracts for differences. Do you think about quotas, free allocation, abolish free allocation? But let's go to Dragoș, Drăgan. You know, how do you see this transformation? How could you push that?
You need to mute yourself if you're not someone is probably watching the live stream at the same time.
Okay, now it's better. Okay, thank you very much for putting me let's say the ball on the in order to express the views. What we are doing and how we are seeing in Romania. Of course, a big transformation is in front of us, and we want to be a part of it. But taking all these advantages, how can we manage it? And there will be, let's say, for industries to keep the competitiveness and to order to face this transformation, should have access to specific and dedicated program to increase the efficiency, to bring them more, to bring them greener in the market. Of course, there is potential of the hydrogen and so on, but also here we have to see that this hydrogen will be commercial available on the market, let's say on commercial basis, it's expected by 2030, when European Union is forecasting to have a production of 10 million tons. Until then, how we can achieve our targets? So through specific program on efficiency that will be dedicated to industry, and here we are working on. And also how we can reach this target of decarbonizing the system and also the electricity system is by increasing the share of renewables. We have a significant forecast of renewables on this decade in Romania, and to achieve this, we're gonna have to put in place some dedicated schemes, and also through this dedicated scheme, the grants that we're gonna offer, and also the loans that will be offered for the specific investment will be backed up by establishing a green bonds market that we want to work on it. Also, CFD for renewable production is also important and give the stability for investor for long-term to secure their renewables and therefore to make them more attractive for investments. That's for sure, because now we are shifting. We had a system with green certificate that was in place and is still in place until the scheme will gonna be end by 2032. But for allowing new investment in these sectors, we're gonna come with specific scheme in order to cover a part of capex and a CFD for renewables. Also important, I think, for the industry to keep the competitiveness until all these pilot project like green steel, cement that we have seen that have been supported by Innovation Fund in Europe, we need to increase the resilience of our economy, and this, I think, it's very important to have a deeper look how this cross-border adjustment mechanism to be in place, because we are looking at us, we being on the east part, we have just 2 countries that are in European Union. We are pushing our producer to pay a higher price for CO2, but on the same time we have seen, let's say, in electricity, the energy coming from Western Ukraine or from former Adria region, from where there are no really traceability of the carbon, and we are seeing this carbon leakage, and how much we as a European will be able to support, because the business then will flow away to other parts that will give more opportunities in terms of benefits. So we have to take care of this. Also, it's very important to increase cooperation between companies in Europe and to act in IPCEI project and program. This is very, very important, and we'll be very glad to see also big Romanian entities to act in this effect. Also, hydrogen is not new. We work with them in specific industries for decades, but we have to bring them to be on commercial basis. And this could be happened only by allowing and helping them to cover the difference to gray hydrogen. And I think all the technology we have to look at it and to see how in this decade to use all the technology that can have an impact and to assure this transition. Also, I pointed out earlier about the needed or to have some flexible generation facilities on Romania in order to back up and secure the resilience and the security of supply. And here I was referring to gas CCGTs, but all the new gas CCGTs that were gonna be commissioned in Romania will be hydrogen ready. Minimum 30% of them will be hydrogen ready. Already the technology is, already we have seen big companies like Siemens, like GE on the market talking with local producers in order to have 6th generation facilities. All this will allow us to reach 2050 to be the first climate neutral continent. So we'll have to look at all these facts that we'll have to work together and to use all the synergies and all the transitional period and fuels in order to achieve our goals.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I'm just wanted to remind the participants, there's a possibility for chats or questions, but it seems that our discussion doesn't really generate questions. We're only generating answers. But if you still have the odd questions, please, come up with them. Before we go to Milan, would like to just thought we all seem to agreeing on carbon contracts for differences, which have to come out either of ETS revenues or out of something else. But for me, the question is this really a fair way of doing it? We don't need to answer this immediately, but let's maybe reflect on this as well. Milan, please, you wanted to come in. If you could also introduce yourself briefly.
Yes, thank you, Christian. My name is Milan Akabart. I'm a research fellow here at CEPS working on climate policy and particularly emissions trading. So I thought the interaction just now between Veronika and Michael was very interesting on basically what to do with free allocation, whether it's even fair at all to give so much of a financial asset to industry. But for now, that is exactly what we have been doing for the past 8 years. And it's almost impossible that we will not do it as well for another 4 years at least before we finalize co-decision, a trialogue, and then implement new rules. So then the question is perhaps, even if a carbon border adjustment mechanism would come into play, which might do something to free allocation volumes, although even that is very controversial still. Say we still have some free allocation in the system. Currently, it is given to the most efficient producers, but most efficient does not necessarily mean very efficient, let alone climate neutral, compatible producers. So there might be also, as a transitional and temporary support system, there might be an opportunity to give some of the free allocation, but only to those producers who are producing in a climate neutral, compatible way. And the distributional implications of that are pretty vast, although they have been like that for over a decade. But we're really talking significant money here. With the carbon price the way it is now, you could easily talk 20 to 30 billion every year. So no matter what we do, that money needs to be used wisely. And maybe just a question to Michael then. Would you, if you would reallocate some of this free allocation, would you consider a new vehicle to be appropriate, or rather an expansion of something existing? So, thank you.
Maybe if I could, Michael, just add, at the moment we spend ETS money on innovation fund, but as we go, we are getting closer. If you have not the first in kind, third of kind, 109th of in kind, we really talk about deployment. Maybe you would also want to reflect on this. How do we get, in addition to the CCFDs, the deployment, please?
Yeah, lots of big questions. At least we can maybe also agree that allocating this 20 to 30 billion to this industry also maybe, like, from a fairness point of view, there's some questions to it. Second, I think also we have to discuss about benchmarks, because also that's basically politically how we are programming the market, and the benchmark system is right now in a way that if you are producing then CO2 free, you're falling out of the benchmark and you do not get free allocation. So basically you're penalized for being CO2 free, which is like a perverse incentive. And then also you have very different categories where less CO2 intense steel making, for instance, does not compete with high CO2 intensive steel making. So also here the benchmarking system is really needs to be changed, because currently it's not a catalyst of decarbonization. Then the question on how we are spending, or how this is to be spent. Well, we are discussing, but it's we're not yet completely finalized with the discussion. Of course, it's the way the modernization fund is framed, the innovation fund is framed, but also then can we set up, for instance, something like CCFDs on the European level? We need to see also how much are the costs, what are the investment needs, what kind of CFD is it? Is it a way where basically when the price on the market is higher than the guaranteed price, you give back to the state? So this is, for instance, the one which we prefer. So there's a guaranteed price. Basically, the difference is paid to the company, to the state, if the company pays more. But if the company earns more, it also pays back. So there is some kind of certainty. And of course, I would agree with the fact that subsidies means that we as the society as a whole paying for certain companies, and that's maybe not the best and the most just way. So therefore, it's important that this period of subsidies is very small. However, it's also a political choice if we want to keep these basic industries, chemistry and steel in Europe, and that's more like a question of strategy. I personally believe this should be a political choice that we keep them here, because, well, world market is not just the world market, it's also geopolitics. And we shouldn't be naive about how this is being used in the future, but also now. And therefore, it's important to keep these industries in Europe as such. I hope to have been able to at least.
Yeah, thank you. Veronika, there's a difference of free allocation between the incentive effect and the distribution effect, the fairness. Can we have both at the same time?
Yeah, let me start maybe at the CCFD issue. I already mentioned in my statement that I am not in favor of not keeping the industries as a whole. So I think we have to do something. And there are many strategic reasons also why we have to keep industries, but I think we have to analyze very clearly to what extent that is a strategic issue. And we have to analyze how we can manage this transition as efficient as possible in terms of spending not too much public money on it, or not unnecessarily much public money on it. That is important. I think that's a thing where you have to look also in the details of this transformation. And that's why I think we will have to use CCFD, but very focused on, based on a strategic analysis and based on an analysis of the transformation path. Maybe it is not a clever transformation path to require them using green hydrogen immediately, if we can also put them in the position to use green hydrogen as soon as it's cheap enough. Maybe that's too expensive. So that was my plea. And the second issue that you mentioned is the free allocation and the transition to the planned carbon border adjustment. I think that's a very, very interesting discussion at the moment. Of course, the carbon border adjustment has been initiated, the strategic planning of it, because politicians knew that the free allocation would fade out. And something has to be done, otherwise we have a clear problem in these industries. And I think it is a very interesting transition phase also, because now we have a change in global politics, and the attitudes, for example, in the US towards global climate cooperation has changed tremendously. And this will be an interesting issue in global climate policy, whether we manage to get into something like a global climate cooperation. That would be much better than a unilateral carbon border adjustment. I think there's big consensus among also economists that this comes with a lot of challenges, also due to the WTO related problems. And if it's WTO compatible, even then it could cause problems in terms of trade conflicts. So I think there we have to set the basis for global climate cooperation, look how far we can go, and the restrictions that we have for ambitious climate policy in Europe will be determined by our possibility to enter into a global climate cooperation with our big trading partners, I think.
Veronika, I mean, the question about the fairness and the incentive, you mentioned the solar panels. We have a similar discussions on the electrical vehicles. It's all the high-end market, which picks up the early technologies. Can you really have a low carbon market, early deployment, and be fair? Or is it not just really giving money, the support to the rich people, which then demand these upper end technologies?
I think it's difficult, but I think we have to be very careful that we are as fair as possible. To give back to people with low income, also a share of, for example, the revenues of the CO2 price, to enable them to contribute to evade paying the CO2 price. Also, this is very important. I mean, the CO2 price is established in order not to pay it. You want the people to evade it, to decarbonize and not to pay it. And so if we put also poorer people in the position to be better off and give them possibilities not to pay the carbon price, because they get possibilities to move carbon neutrally, to do their heating carbon neutrally and so on, I think this will bring forward a fair transformation. And I think without a fair transformation, I think it's also crucial because without it being fair, we will not be able to make it rapid, to make it quick, because somehow people will will not be in line with it, and will emphasize this in their voting decisions and so on. So you have to give them opportunities, and I think we have to be very careful, because we will reduce the speed tremendously if we don't care for it. Because that's a huge part of the voters that will either agree with and go with the people who foster the transformation, or hinder it by their voting decision in the end. Yeah,
thank you. There was Michael, I saw you were nodding, but you also wanted to say something. You get the floor. Don't worry, we have still another 15 minutes to go. Daniel Groth had requested to broadcast that should be done, but maybe I want to go to Charlotta. You know, we got now in a very sort of European, granular discussion where we discuss very difficult issues. How does that reflect from an investor perspective? If you just could bring us a little bit to the broad lines. What do you make out of this before we go into the details how a CCFD should be structured? So what is really important for your trillions to move to the right thing? And then we come to Daniel.
Yeah, no, I think it's a very, very important question. And maybe as a first point, I think that the way the Europe works is difficult, because it is very complex, because there are so many different countries that need to agree. And I think in the beginning, the example around, we can't redistribute at the European level. We don't have that fiscal authority. And a lot of questions in Europe comes back to the same issue. Maybe around the CCFD, I'm not an expert on that at all. I just put that out. But it has to do with the volatility in the carbon price. It has to do with the uncertainty that you don't really know what kind of income stream, what kind of returns you're going to get in the future. And it comes back to this notion of certainty that I said before. I think as an investor, that is absolutely key. And to have a kind of a top-down strategy, which is communicated very clearly, because I think climate change is so complex anyway. It's so many details, and we need to know the details, but investors, they want to see the big picture. So I think being able to bring that out, it's also very, very important. And maybe just the last one, which I just wanted to join into that discussion around distribution and how do we compensate people who are less wealthy for the costs. And I think, yes, we should return the money to them, or in some way. But I think the other one, it comes back to strategy, is the case where you don't have local buses. You have to drive. And if you don't drive, you're locked out of society. So you need a higher level strategy. How do you tackle those transportation issues? that's probably not going to be tackled by the market. Investors are not going to go in and take care of the local bus network, but that's super important for these policies to gain ground. It's not just money; it's actually making sure there is an alternative. And if I may round up, I think what we're seeing with the US joining in again on climate change is a huge positive, and it creates more dynamics and more momentum. And I think will probably benefit Europe as well as US to get more competition in a sense in the field, create more urgency, and also more cooperation around these issues.
Thank you. Daniel, I think you can broadcast, at least I see you.
Thanks a lot, Christian. We just had an interesting session on global climate diplomacy with the negotiators from the US and the EU side. And despite all my efforts, I couldn't get them to disagree. So at least at the diplomatic level, we are on one page. Remains to be seen whether we will actually converge in the actual implementation. And here I wanted to add one point which I find very important regarding the ETS and the free allowances. First of all, I think some people have said that, but it deserves to be reiterated. Manufacturing industry has, until this year, received, on average, 100% of the allowances it needed, right? So that is, of course, only the income distribution. The question is, what were the incentives facing a firm when you have free allowances? Now, if you had free allowances once and for all, you would say, okay, now I reduce production and of the old installation and do it somewhere else. But if you do that under the distribution system for the free allowances, actually you lose free allowances. So in that sense, it is not so much about that we have free allowances, but the way they are being allocated as a function of production. Now, my simple proposal, therefore, would be the following. If industry claims it cannot survive without these free allowances, why don't we give them the free allowances for the next 5 years for free now, but 0 later? And they get these allowances independently of the level of production. That way, we would really have the incentive. They can't complain. And also, we are then free to introduce a carbon border adjustment mechanism, which wouldn't run afoul of WTO rules. Would anybody care to comment on that?
Can I leave this open? And we have about 10 minutes, so you don't need to comment too long on it if you don't wish. Anybody wants to pick? Dan, Drăgan, you probably feel in a very difficult situation at the moment, taking away the freedom from industry.
Yes, could be, I think, could be one alternative. And also we have to make the mechanism in a such way, not just giving them for free, but also to have some target in terms of increasing efficiency and moving to greener products and less CO2 emission and level of industries. We know that there are specific sectors that having a higher share of CO2 emission. And I think that efforts should be addressed especially to this, because also we want to increase the resilience, we want to increase the circularity in the European market. And all this should be work together to our aim. And this could be an alternative, but I think should be better to be assessed by specialists and to have some simulation and to see sensitiveness of such a proposal.
Thank you. Michael, you want to have a go at this, and then Veronika, Charlotta? Or, I mean, Michael, I promised you the floor. You know, you wanted to say
so many things to comment on. Yes, I mean, altogether, I think that the question is, why would I decarbonize if I get free allowances? The price is just not working on me. I mean, it doesn't make sense. So there should, I mean, there has to be other incentives and structures that you decarbonize, because you don't do it if you, I mean, there's no price for you. So I think what was so nice to hear from Charlotta was this certainty argument. So what we disagreed on CCFDs a little bit. I wonder if we disagree on quotas, because that actually gives you a lot of certainty where the market will go. Yes, and then giving the free allocation for the 5 years for free, and then nothing anymore. So you at least have a little bit of incentive, because you know at some point it will end. So that's good. My idea would be to get rid of the whole system of free allocation altogether, because also the biggest argument for it is the carbon leakage, but also the Court of Auditors tells us that this is a really weak argument until now, and we haven't really seen carbon leakage. So together with a huge new framework like quotas, maybe CCFDs, maybe a carbon border adjustment, I think it could be a way to transform without free allocation. Maybe just, also I thought we were discussing more about the carbon border adjustment. Also for as a thought to Veronika, going now more into the idea of development economics, you know, there is this infant industry argument, which basically says you need to protect industry until they're market ready, because otherwise they won't get market ready, because always the competitor will be able to have the whole market, take up the whole market. So, I mean, and this is the legitimization for the carbon border adjustment. And if we, I mean, there is also, of course, an idea of having, you know, like international clubs and coordinating it and so on, or even having a one CO2 price for the whole globe, which we in the beginning fortunately said already this is impossible. It's very difficult to put up ETS system on the European level. So, like speaking about it on the whole world, well, that's good that we understand that this is impossible. So, what do you think about this this infant industry argument?
Yeah, that's a very complicated discussion. Maybe let me first go back to Daniel Groth's issue. I think, I mean, there is an incentive to decarbonize. If you give the free allocation, and there is nevertheless the price, you can sell your certificates. So it's more profitable to decarbonize. And by selling them and decarbonizing, you don't risk, as far as I understood, Daniel, to be reduced your free allocation in the future. So you will have this incentive. So this could be a way but what I'm not so convinced about is that you really avoid the WTO problems. I think it's not only a legal issue, but it is also an issue of interpretation of trading partners. And it could well be, I mean, it could just be that it is nevertheless interpreted, even though it would be WTO compatible, as somehow an unfair institution, and there would be retaliation measures nevertheless. So it's not sure that this is the ideal way. I think the ideal way would be to agree with trading partners on a climate cooperation on a more global level. And as you mentioned, they don't disagree on that, at least in diplomacy. But I think the hard issue is then to agree actually on a mechanism of doing so. I think one issue that I would like to mention, we have done an extensive study on carbon border adjustment and the prerequisites in the context of our yearly report of the German Council of Economic Advisors. And we looked at the value chains and how the CO2 footprint develops along the value chains of products. And they are very long. And it's very complicated, I think, to establish a carbon border adjustment mechanism that has not effects like shifts along the value chains that are done strategically in order to avoid being included in the carbon border adjustment. I think you cannot include all the emissions that a product contains when it is imported. You always have to cut somewhere. Producers will then try to shift the emission-intensive industries further down the value chain so that they are not counted anymore upon import. And this is a challenge, I think, that is not really well understood yet. So there's a little bit of data around there addressing it, but I think that's very dangerous that we set up a mechanism that in the end leads to strategic reaction of producers along value chains. Concerning the infant industries, I think the main issue is I understand that you refer to those future markets that I mentioned in the beginning. And I think the major problem is that many companies in all sectors now look at their actual business and look at which businesses will just vanish because they will not survive. And they look at what are the business fields of the future where their expertise is big and which promise a lot of revenues, sales, and so on. I think for the state, for the government, it's very difficult to see all this because it's many industries, and it's too complicated, too complex in order to really focus at the side from the side of the government on certain issues. I think we would have to do something like funding them or helping them to get money for future business fields via the financial markets. And I think a very important, and that's one issue why I am so much in favor of market institutions and to make a reliable policy towards market institutions that punish CO2 emissions in the future, because then financial markets will become interested in business fields that help solving the problem, because these will be the most successful ones in the future. And if the expertise is increased in the financial sector in looking for those business fields, and if there is this regulatory certainty, so we have some reliability that there is reliability, the Green Deal will be provoking a massive change of the environment. And then I think money will flow into these fields. I think to plan it centrally will not be possible. It's just too complex and too much across all the economy. And so I think we have to go through the financial markets.
Thank you. Thank you for Veronika. Maybe if you allow, we leave this as a final remark. Our time is up. Unless if some of you wants to have a last very short comment, we can have it, but we are already 2 minutes over time. If this is not the case, let me just thank the speakers, the participants for joining this deep, controversial, and quite difficult discussion. of which I'm sure we're gonna discuss not just in the German elections, also in many other countries and many instances. I just sincerely hope that Charlotta, the investor community, will not become impatient with this discussion if it drags on too long. I picked up 3 points which in all the discussions I thought are interesting. We came to the point whether we are not having too much focus on the existing industries, because we don't know what the future industries, the future growing and low carbon industries will be. And I think that's some reflection to have in Europe. Now, Dan, Dragoș, you not probably politically not so easy to do than to intellectually to agree. I think we also, had some discussions without being all in agreement whether regulation or the carbon price is the best way for creating certainty. There is a price volatility. It has at least been in the past. I think in the future it may be different. I would not see that carbon price going down very rapidly, very fast, and being very volatile, but you never know. And then I think the other question was, or interesting point for me was, we discussed a lot about fairness, but then at the other hand we want to have effectiveness, and these two don't always go hand in hand. There may be trade-offs, very hard trade-offs, and it's nice in the election campaigns or elsewhere to speak about it and say we need both, but at the end of the day somebody has to take decisions. And perhaps if you really want to do something on climate change, effectiveness will be more important, and the fairness will not be so easy to achieve, but politically, of course, very important. But I leave this to more competent people than me, to the politicians, which I have in front of me. So let us just finish here. Thank you all for fascinating discussion, and have a good afternoon and a good evening. And I hope we welcome you again in the Ideas Lab or in some other events. Thank you.